IBM has been on a great trajectory under Arvind's watch. He's really turned the company around. So the 2010s were kind of a lost decade. A lot of us wondered about IBM's continued relevance. Since then, it's been pretty much on an upward track.
Welcome to It's About Data, episode 67. Tony is joining us from the show floor of IBM Think 2026. Tony, welcome. You are on the Expo floor at IBM Think, broadcasting. It will be not quite live by the time it goes out, but it will be a couple of hours old. Tell us what's going on this year with IBM.
Well, we'll give a couple quick headlines. One was basically I just came out of the quantum Q&A session, and a couple interesting factoids here. Basically, IBM is actually being very bullish about this. Cleveland Clinic just did a real breakthrough experiment, which they were essentially able to assemble a 12,000 atom protein molecule. That's really quite a breakthrough in terms of the scale of a problem that's being tackled with quantum. And I asked, I asked very briefly, this question I had on my mind, and actually it's like the answer was like, of course, stupid. But I was wondering about, the resource footprint, because I know, for instance, like in the annealing stage, basically, these quantum processors have to be chilled down to close to absolute zero.
Yeah.
And turns out the resource footprint, at least with power, is pretty trivial. It's in megawatts rather than gigawatts. So that answered a big question, coming right out. The other sort of, before we go into the announcements, the other sort of, I think, just to set the context here is that IBM has been on a great trajectory, under Arvind's watch. He's really turned the company around. I mean, when he started in 2020, he inherited basically, as far as I'm concerned, the 2010s were kind of a lost decade. And the revenue was down 4.6% that year, which was a string of well over a decade of declining revenue. And basically, a lot of us wondered about IBM's continued relevance. Since then, it's been pretty much on an upward track each year. It's been anywhere from last year, or I should say 2024, it was only about 1.5%, but that was the lowest. Most of them were 3 to 5% range. But last year, 2025, IBM's revenue jumped 7.6%. And they really ascribe that to a lot of interest in AI and agents. I also ascribe to the fact that IBM is not trying to be like a Me Too when it comes to generative AI. They're not trying to basically, compete on the biggest and baddest frontier models. They're not trying to be Claude. They're not trying to be GPT or Gemini. They're coming in really that really appeals to their base, which is the narrower models, the Granite models that tend to be smaller and very purpose built.
And just collaboration with other companies right in the domain.
Yeah.
And the remarkable thing about this is we've been hearing for months about the SaaS apocalypse. I mean, granted, maybe it will come in the future, but IBM to a significant degree is a software company, as you were saying before, and they seem to be doing fine by building software that works with AI systems.
Yeah, well, let's put it this way. Let's table the SaaS apocalypse, discussion to next week when I come when I'm at SAP Sapphire, because that's really we'll be in the belly of the beast by then.
Yeah, fair enough.
But I do have a lot of thoughts about that. But anyway, let me just kind of I'm going to go over some of the major announcements here, which we'll review. And obviously, in the data space, which of most interest to folks like you and myself, is Confluent. The deal is just closed, and basically, it really, for IBM, it really does fill a gap. I mean, yes, they've had messaging before this. They were amongst the pioneers on that, but Confluent really, really puts them, especially with Kafka and Kafka queues, basically it makes that native, to their platforms. I mean, obviously, this is going to be a work in progress, but essentially, one of the first things that we're talking about is basically making table flow, which is a way of essentially materializing. It's not really physically materializing, but materializing streaming data as tables that can be read by watsonx.data.
Yeah.
And so I think that's pretty important. They're obviously doing a lot of work with obviously since with IBM and Q is so entrenched in their base. Obviously, they're optimizing the interface with that. But I think we just tapped the surface. My colleague Dave Vellante over at theCUBE and and SiliconANGLE, and hopefully a future guest that we'll have on the summer,
Yeah.
came up with a really interesting question, which is could Confluent be that sort of real time sort of messaging layer that basically is used to evaluate, to basically to vet agents. And that was a
Hmm.
really interesting, but again, that's something which is really belongs, it's real, that's real future talk. But
It's a
I found
longer
that to be a
discussion.
rather interesting proposition. And
Yeah.
actually, we'll talk to him about it when we put him down in a few months.
Yeah.
Um, but another interesting thing, and this is really more of kind of like, gee, that was kind of interesting. I wouldn't call it a major announcement. Um, is they're doing is they've actually come up with GPU acceleration for SQL, for SQL calls. And I was going kind of a WTF on that. It evidently, according to some of their benchmarks, even with the fact that GPUs do tend to be more pricey, the acceleration gets pretty insane. Um, but again, that was just kind of like they sort of like let that out as a teaser,
Yeah.
and that's something which we'll talk about further when we get to talk to the IBM folks, and later on. I've got a queue of basically of guests, later on. But anyway, that was kind of an interesting thing. Um, then in the area of agentic control, everybody's coming up with their agentic control planes. Google was very big on that. And so that's obviously Watson X Orchestrate. Orchestrate is certainly not new. It's been out for a couple years. Um, but essentially, they've been expanding it to get beyond just the agents that are basically created within the IBM environment, and
Oh,
so they're
interesting.
yeah, Lang, agents create Langflow, LangGraph, and basically reaching out to and I'm expecting them to support some sort of A to A type protocol, whether it's
Yeah.
the A to A type protocol. I can't really tell you at this point. In general, what's kind of interesting is I think there was a lot more talk about A2A last year, which was a protocol that Google donated to open source. But I didn't really even hear Google speak that much about it. And there is, I think, some thought that maybe MCP has kind of co-opted it.
Yeah.
So there is, but anyway, so they have I'm not going to go into detail on this because I really not had a chance to really study it in depth. But obviously, with Orchestrate, with the control plane, they're looking at observability. They're looking at also as like it can be your sandbox for runtime evaluation and performance optimization. Um, Also looking at as part of the sandbox, some expanded simulation capabilities, audit logging, and that sort of thing. Again, this is a type of thing which I expect is going to be table stakes for everybody here, and I expect to hear some fairly similar things from Databricks, for instance. When I'm there in a few weeks. So, but anyway, but very a lot of messaging around Watson X Orchestrate.
Yeah, no, totally makes sense. And I was very interested in what you were saying about data access control, right, in your
Yeah,
LinkedIn post recently. And like you said, you haven't had a chance to dig in, but like if I'm a CTO, if I'm a CDO, or even if I'm an engineer, that's, as you said, table stakes, right? If I don't have those things
right.
in place, then turning agents loose is just a potential nightmare of liability and bad
Right.
press.
Yeah. One of the more curious announcements, and also I will say curious in terms of branding as well, is IBM Bob. Now, does that
That's
name ring a bell?
Microsoft Bob, right? What was that, the Windows 95 era or something? I don't even remember.
Whatever. I guess somebody, feels that there's a second life to this.
Right.
But it is a simplified, basically development environment, for churning out agents,
Yeah.
and they've actually, they've been sort of releasing. It was originally Project Bob back in the fall, and now they're actually unleashing it. But they actually have done a lot of vetting internally, and they claim that basically up to 80,000 folks, beyond just the core 20,000 pro code developers, have been using this, and they claim to have seen 30 to 40% improved productivity. So hey, let's invite a few more folks to the party, um, and especially folks who are named Robert.
Yes. Well, and I want to hear people's experiences with this tool. What does productivity mean in this case? What about safety and all the other things we have to think about? But it sounds exciting.
Yeah, exactly. Another couple points, and the next one basically is what they call sovereign core,
Hmm.
and I think this really doubles down on IBM's really core strength, which is it knows hybrid,
Yeah.
it knows the data center, it knows on prem, and it's not bashful about bringing the types of capabilities that you would expect in a hyperscale environment in public cloud, into your own, private environment. And it's
Yeah.
because that's where, so many IBM, customers are.
Yeah.
And it's not that they're not, doing any cloud deployments at all, but there are certain types of data sets, certain databases, certain applications, they're just not going to, that are not going to go outside the firewall.
No,
And
agree. And I
so,
mean, things like IBM mainframes, they're just hard to migrate off of, right? If you're an
exactly.
airline, you've been on a mainframe since the 70s, you keep updating that software, but you also want to be on the cloud and have a very viable app that's hybrid. And that's what IBM has figured out over the last like 2
Oh,
decades.
come on, Matt. The mainframe's dead.
I hear that every year, basically.
Yeah,
Here we
it's
are.
kind of like the old. Now I'm dating myself, but the early joke on SNL back when they started back in the '70s. Francisco Franco is still dead. But but anyway, the fact is that mainframe is just as dead as on-prem.
Right.
So this,
Which
and
means
I
that
mean that
it's not.
very
Yeah.
ironically here. Okay, folks.
Right. Yeah.
The fact is, there's a lot of. I mean, main. There's no reason to to redo those reservation systems that are on mainframes, and for data basically that in applications that are very sensitive, you're not going to go into a public cloud on that.
Yeah.
And so what they've come out with is something called Sovereign Core. Net
Mhm.
recognizes a couple things. Sovereign being one, that this needs to be sovereign to our data center environment, but it also responds to, let's say, even if you're in the public cloud, that this is sovereign within a country or region.
Mhm.
As I said, I've not had what it really is essentially is it's a way of checking your compliance and enforcing it to whatever policies and directives that you're subject to, or regulations, especially with regard to data residency. And so, what you do is you define a boundary. And then within that, you're managing it. And this is not a complete list by any means, but
Right.
you're managing, for instance, identity and access management. Within that boundary, you're managing encryption. It's also the management of keys, and all the audit trails and logs. And I think what's very I think very interesting about this, it comes with 160 by their count pre-bundled regulatory frameworks, sort of like jump starts. In other words,
Got it.
does it comply basically with with basically a specific regulation for data sovereignty?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
you know, GRDC or whatever. I forget the acronym there.
Yeah.
It's 106 of them. They're prepackaged so that you can run that as ready tests, kind of ready checks. So I think very interesting, and I think also very responsive to essentially what their customers go with.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, there's a lot of global chaos right now, and having
Yeah,
AI in the mix only makes that more complicated. Like, what data goes
right,
to what
right,
model? What data can go to OpenAI? What data is allowed to go to Anthropic, for
exactly.
example? Yeah,
The last thing on the list, and again, there's a lot more in terms of data that I want to follow up on. So
yeah.
we've only scratched the surface, but I'm just really dealing with the headlines here. Is basically the latest release of Concert. Um, Concert was initially introduced probably about 24 months ago. But essentially what it is, it's a rethinking of your environment management,
Mhm.
your IT infrastructure management, reimagine, in an era with AI and where essentially, the management is really executed through agents. And it really, it kind of bridges what used to be like a very complex tool chain, like, Turbonomic, Instana, and so on. And so what they, and essentially it's, more immediately, it's really the successor to Cloud Pak for AI Ops, which still required a lot of manual configuration, a
Yeah,
lot of, just a lot of assembly. There's just a lot of assembly required. Concert is basically much more of a unified, experience. Um, and they've added a number of, basically, it's incremental, but it's important, which is that as you have agents, we're starting to look more upstream, looking at the dependencies. We're
yeah,
doing a lot more event correlation, um, and also what they're introducing is not just basically monitoring, but all and recommendations, but now also they're adding some capabilities to do to do auto remediation. And that's very much in line with
interesting.
the roadmap that they have, which we talked with Miron, a few months ago, and just had the latest episode yesterday
Database autonomy.
about
Yep.
about database autonomy, and this
Yeah.
is essentially about infrastructure autonomy.
Yeah.
And it's not that we're going to expect that your environment is going to manage itself. I mean, there is going to be significant human in the loop, but you won't have to do. You'll have as many knobs and dials. You won't have as much in the way of assembly that you have to do, and basically the introspection is going to go. It's going to be looking into it's optimized for an era where we're going to be seeing agents that basically depend on other agents, and so interdependencies become even more important now.
Yeah.
And so it's essentially, so those are basically the headlines this week.
Yeah.
As I said, I wouldn't say that there were nothing that was really dramatic or earth shaking, unless you want to count what the Cleveland Clinic did with basically with quantum, basically on material. But still, I think very important, and also more. I think what's even more important is that IBM's growth, which I mean, IBM has been growing. It really it took a sharp uptick last year, so it's definitely that IBM's definitely on the right path.
Yeah, and they've been able to maintain these core businesses, like you said, mainframes. I don't know as a percentage of revenue if that's probably shrunk over time, but they've also been able to move into these new domains in a very rapidly changing software and AI environment, which is remarkable, I think.
One thing I'll credit also Dave Vellante on, in his analysis, and and he has it in Silicon Angle. He published it this morning at the Cube Research, which is that the piece that was missing is really at this point the semantic tier, the ontology tier. And I would expect here that IBM would probably make an acquisition. And there certainly are startups out there that are doing this.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised within the next year or so that we'll see something there.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Acquisition or major partnership or something along those lines. But IBM has been in the acquisition mood lately, quite frankly, right?
So, and I think also when it comes to ontology, there is definitely a lot of startup activity there. And so I think IBM has a lot of potential there to basically do some acqui-hires there.
Yeah, there's definitely an opportunity here, and that allows them to integrate this into their core products rather than having it be an external partnership that you have to connect out to and that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Anyway, I've got a plane to catch.
All right. Well, fantastic. Well, I'll get this episode turned around. It should be out in a couple of hours.
Sounds good. Good talking. See you next week at Sapphire.
Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye.